Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Michael Belch, and as always, I am joined by my brother Bradley Belch. And we are today going to do a follow-up interview to our discussion that we had with James Silberman on the topic of abortion abolition. We are very excited to explore some of the thoughts that conversation triggered. We had a lot of them, and we really appreciated James's time and his clarity coming on the show and talking with us. It helped us tremendously understand some of what is necessary if we are really serious about rebuilding pillars of society. It is good to talk and to understand, but at some point, we have to go out and we have to do some work. We have to actually build and rebuild things. And we're very thankful for James doing the work that he's doing. And certainly that discussion challenged and motivated the two of us to think about what we can actually do to rebuild and not just kind of sit and observe with popcorn watching the, as Andrew Clavin says, laughing our way through the fall of the Republic. But no, that's not our goal here. Our goal is to understand how all of society can be influenced and informed by God's word, and then to take steps to move society in that direction. So we want to remind you just briefly that all of our content can be found on our website, rebuildpodcast.com. Additionally, we offer the audio for this in podcast form wherever you find podcasts, and also the video and the audio together on our YouTube channel, which is Rebuild Podcast. So, all right, Bradley, let's go ahead and dive into this discussion. And we had a bit of a hard time settling or narrowing down how we wanted to handle this follow-up as we kind of strategized about it. Yeah,
absolutely. I think in large part because James was very clear and articulate on his points. He was well informed. He was well spoken. He argued his case well. We don't have a lot of disagreements. In fact, I think we would largely agree across the board with the direction he was headed with it. So we have a couple points of clarification, and then we might spin off into a deeper question into kind of how we get the ship of the abortion abolition moving, as well as just the ship of cultural movement moving in the right direction. So,
yeah. Well, since you mentioned the points of clarification, and since I have no idea what you're talking about, why don't you mention the points of clarification?
Yeah, so there's a tension between the purist abortion abolitionists and the incremental pro-life movement, in that the abolitionists want to get all the way, whatever the cost. Like, and some of them would even say it's all or nothing. And then the pro-life incrementalists say, let's take the battles along, to take the wins along the way, and as long as we're making forward progress, it's good. And James helped steer that conversation pretty well by putting the gospel at the center of the issue and working from there. So that's what I mean. Clarify the point there. So if you want to take it from there.
Yeah. What was helpful was the idea that the abolitionists have a biblically and politically defensible target and goal, right? Their goal aligns with their political philosophy and their biblical understanding of life and sin and civil crime. And their goal, because of that, is the total and complete abolition of all abortion in America, well, in the world. And yet, I think James was on the verge of conceding that if that's the goal, you're going to have to take some steps. Sometimes you're going to have to take some steps along the way to get there. And we likened it to, as we were talking before this, to a battlefield. Your goal as a battalion or an army might be you're trying to take over that fort on the hill. And that is where your sight is focused, where your strategy is aimed. And yet, to get there, you might have to take a trench or take an embankment or a ruin or something on your way up. It would be somewhat foolhardy in some cases to just sprint straight up the hill. And I don't know that these two things are actually at odds. As long as I'll just speak for myself. As long as the conversation and the continual push is we want to abolish abortion. Okay, you want to abolish it 20 weeks? Better than nothing, but okay, what are we going to do now? Are we going to continue? And as long as it's not, we got to 20 weeks and so we're done, I think the goal of abolishing abortion can be accomplished. It could be by God's grace, just suddenly with one giant leap. But it might be done through several steps along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, and James, made it clear that we have to start from the gospel.
Yeah.
And when we start from the gospel, like you said, the position is extremely defensible, and we can work towards that. He says the dilemma with some of the incrementalists, pro-life people, is that their target is too narrow and too short-sighted, and has some holes in it when you actually break it down to the philosophical and or theological perspective.
Right.
So if we start from the premise that it's wrong across the board, and as long as we're moving, like you said, as long as we're moving towards that goal, we can take the wins along the way. And I would say to that, if you look at, because there are some abolitionists who say all or nothing. It's going to be all or nothing. I'm not gonna vote for a bill that takes a small step in the right direction. I want all or nothing. But if you look at the way we got to where we are now, you and I were talking, it was an incremental win starting from a feminist movement that got to a point of Roe versus Wade to where, 40 years now, 60 years in the making, they've incrementally tightened down the straps of the codification of Roe versus Wade, and praise the Lord that likely, although I don't know what they're dragging their feet about. It was supposed to be a week ago, and now, early this week, and now this, late this week, and still nothing. But hopefully, praise the Lord, that's going to get overturned. My point is, the incremental approach worked to destroy the premise of life starts in the womb at conception. And so we should be okay and comfortable in the position of small victories along the way.
Yeah. And one thing I thought was, I think the most common objection to the abortion abolitionist is that's not practical. We cannot do that. It's not sustainable. There's no political will behind it, etc. And it kind of reminded me of the interview we had with Joel Webbin about postmillennialism. He said that the difference between postmillennials and premillennials is simply what they think is possible. And we need to believe that ridding America of abortion is possible by God's grace, but also by our vigor and our willingness to put in the work. I mean, we need to believe that that's possible. We also need to kind of steel ourselves that it could be a process.
Yeah. Yeah, our level of tolerance for things, it's to a degree like the frog boiling in the pot, right? Like whether you're on the left or the right, your level of tolerance increases for the environment that you're in, until eventually the pot gets too hot and then you start bucking. And conservatives now,
or you die.
Conservative now are definitely trying to buck it. But as the temperature's been escalating, conservatives have been going, it's getting a little hotter in here. We might want to try to stop this, boiling water, or doing what we can to get out of the boiling water. And so we can actually reverse that, and likely maybe eventually we get to the point, say we get to an abortionist or abolition. That might be turning the heat up on the abortion advocates, and they might turn around and try and buck the trend. And at that point is where we have to maintain the pressure, right? Like you don't turn down the heat when they buck against you. You sustain the pressure.
Yeah.
But incrementally along the way, small adjustments along the way, we're gonna make ground, and then we just need to sustain it over time and continue. But the large point is aim big, aim for the full kit and caboodle, and take the wins along the way. I think is where you and I come down on the issue.
Yeah.
Before we move on to kind of a tailspin off of this discussion, did you have anything in the way that you wanted to talk about some of the discussion that we had as far as the legal penalization of the women and or the man, the husband or wife or father or mother, however you want to phrase it, the legal action we can take against those particular individuals? I think James had some good insight into that. But did you have anything you want to say about that?
I just wanted to say that the legal system that we have, while not perfect, it has a lot at its core that's very good. And one of the things that's already built in, and I guess I should have realized it if I had thought about it, but that he pointed out was we already have the ability legally to evaluate different situations and different circumstances with evidence and a judge's perspective and different laws that would weigh in. And so I think it's a bit of a straw man argument to say that if you outlaw abortion at conception, that all mothers are immediately going to be, given the death penalty or punished equally with the abortion doctor. And I guess what I would say is in Deuteronomy, in several places, and then it's hinted at also in Psalms later on, but in Deuteronomy, in several places, God tells the Israelites, when you go into the land and you see the people there, do not have pity on them, because I have commanded you to destroy them for their wickedness. Right? And God points out that the one of the great dangers that Israel would have, and in fact did have, in accomplishing its mission of driving evil out of the promised land, would be to pity the people once they saw them face to face. And it's easy and it sounds so nice to want to be soft and quote unquote caring and quote unquote loving, but really God's standard is the definition of love and of justice. And so there's a sense where Christians will have to steel ourselves for the potential of actually carrying out sentences against mothers and abortion doctors, but mothers is the big one, right? I don't think it'll have to happen often, if at all. Most people are as cowardly as some of the conservatives are being right now, and but we do need to steel ourselves to not allow a false sense of being more loving than God or more compassionate than God to get to interfere with our ability to carry out what God says is really justice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And I think it applies to so much more than the abortion movement. we get into it a little bit in an upcoming podcast that we just recorded earlier with Stephen Wolf. That we need to be comfortable with using political power because God has put leaders. We all as Christians acknowledge that God places leaders into positions of authority, but then we really get uncomfortable when we enact that authority that God has given us to use political power.
Right.
And so right along those lines, you're absolutely right. We need to be prepared for what it means to say, yep, this is flat out wrong, and we need to stand strongly against it. And if that means that that some mothers and some fathers, I emphasize the fathers just because I think they are just as equally liable in a lot of cases as the mothers. I mean, they are half of the equation. If we put legal action against them, we need to be ready to follow through with that. Not because we are better than them, not because we are cruel, but exactly what you said, but because God's standard is God's standard, and love and justice cannot be measured by the human eye or the human heart, but only by the truths that God has established in his word, and the standards that he has as the creator and sustainer of all things.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, we wanted to pivot here a little bit and just talk about some thoughts that our conversation with James sparked in us. One of them that I was thinking about was an idea that both of us have heard from Steve Deace. And by the way, you all, if you don't listen to Steve Deace's podcast, I recommend it very highly. It's just,
and if by some miracle you have a connection to Steve Deace, hook us up.
Well,
we would love to have Steve.
Joel does. He was just on Joel Webbin's podcast last week.
That is true. So, that is true. Yeah, come on, Joel, hook us up.
But that's Steve Deace. He spells his name Deac. So there we go. There's the free plug. Something he said a little while ago was, given the stakes of the battle that we're in America right now, and given the rapid plunge into depravity. I mean, when he said this, it was before this insane popularization of the family-friendly drag shows, right? And so that just goes to show you, even from when he said this maybe a month ago to now, I mean, we are continuing to find new depths into which to descend as a society. So what he said was, given the stakes and given the trajectory that we are on, he was comfortable basically saying, I will work with anybody to push truth and conservative values and Christian belief, as long as that person is not expecting me to give up my conservatism and my Christianity. But he would be willing to work with someone on an issue over which they agreed, even if he very much disagreed with that person about some other issues, because he feels like we need all the forces we can to propel society back towards God, back towards true morality. Okay. Now, what got me thinking was just a few days ago, I heard an interview with Dennis Prager, who, when you think of Dennis Prager, I mean, you've got PragerU. He is one of the champions, really, of conservatism in our time. Very well spoken, very well thought.
I'm just going to point out right here, he's Ben Shapiro before Ben Shapiro.
That's right. Ben Shapiro before Ben Shapiro. Yep. Even down to the fact that he is a Jew and has written a number of commentaries on the Old Testament. Okay.
Yep.
But really a conservative voice. And what struck me was the interview that I heard with him is he said that he does not believe that abortion ought to be outlawed until the second trimester of the pregnancy. In other words, and he said it's a life. The morality would say that we preserve it, but it's just something that we have to do as a society. We have to allow abortion all the way through the first trimester. Okay? And it was not an argument of we can't get it passed. It was his philosophical position that this is the right way to go. It got me thinking about Steve Deace's comment. So Bradley, what do you think, how, especially with, James said that abortion is the most important political and moral issue facing our country right now. Ought we, as people who are calling for the complete destruction and abolition of abortion, ought we to be willing to side with conservatives who do not view abortion in the same way?
I would say yes, absolutely. I think in a war, if we're gonna picture this as a war battlefield, and I believe all life is a spiritual war. In a war, you pick the areas that are most needed to address, to hold the flank or to hold the line, and whoever is on that line willing to fight that flank or that line with you, you embrace, regardless of whether they agree with you on the full scale of the war. Um, it is a pure game of numbers, and to Steve Deace's point, I will ally with anyone willing to tackle this head on. Now, when we win things like the potential overturning of Roe versus Wade, we're going to have different alignments and it's going to realign to a degree, and then we'll face that battle and we'll see where the cards fall and partner with the people that are willing to partner with us on that. Because even someone like a Dennis Prager, who, like you said, stated that he acknowledges it's a life in the womb, you can have a reasonable conversation with him much more than you're going to be able to have a reasonable conversation with where we're at now. And ultimately, you might have to engage in a battle with him head on head, or people who hold that viewpoint. But right now, we need all hands on deck in simply movement in the right direction, and then we'll address whatever presents itself next, beyond that.
When you say that, are you speaking of highlighting and promoting conservative values with this specific example of Dennis Prager, or do you mean you would work with Dennis Prager to get as far as we can on the abortion question specifically?
Both. I mean, the abortion thing is a conservative value, and to that extent, maybe the distinction you're drawing is, would I be willing to say we've got abortion and trans, and both Dennis Prager and I agree to on some front, attack those ideologies, and we gain ground on the abortion front to the point where him and I become at odds, whether it's first trimester or second trimester, that we should push for. We can have that battle, but if we've made no ground on the trans movement, I'm still completely willing to draw lines differently, if even physically able. I mean, this is a hypothetical that, as the conservative movement, we haven't really ever reached. Maybe Trump has distinguished that a little bit, saying, okay, I'm with you here, I'm not with you there, but we can do both at the same time. We can move towards a progression on the trans movement, the trans ideology here, and we can hash out the ground over here on the abortion topic. I don't know if that's what you're driving at, but I would say conservatism at large, yes, partner with. If that aligns biblically with the direction, great. If that doesn't, that can be a battle for another day, so to speak.
Yeah, it is what I'm talking about, but it's not a hypothetical situation. I think I mentioned this article that I read in one of our other discussions. It was a Substack page, Holly Math Nerd, whom I read originally regarding a really well done and devastating article about trans issues. She was basically just calling out the insanity that's going on. But and so I read a few of her other articles, and in the ensuing articles, she basically said, that classic, I didn't leave the left or the Democratic Party left me. And she was basically calling people who are Democrats of 10, 15, 20 years ago, so more liberal, to abandon the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party because they at least have a grasp on sanity still. But then she said, we're just going to have to, once we get there, ask them to see our perspective on some of the issues over which we disagree right now. And so I think this is an interesting question that we have to think about as the left is being more and more insane. I mean, California and one other state talking about abortion bills that would allow killing an infant even after birth for a certain number of days. Like, this is insanity. And people are going to be leaving that. And, we only have two parties in America, really. And so they're going to be joining conservative parties. And I'm not going to lie, I'm a little leery about the position of I'll work with anybody on any issue as long as it'll put conservatism a little bit farther forward. Or I won't even cheapen it, as long as it'll put biblical values a little bit farther forward. I think it's something we have to think about, and I don't honestly have a good answer for it right now.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I'll take the point. Well, that maybe there's more to consider than just a improvement for improvement's sake. But again, when it comes to numbers and just numbers games, I just don't know how some things. Now, what I'm blatantly ignoring here is the power of God and the spirit that works within the human heart. But from just a sheer numbers and the way that things get accomplished, it's hard for me to see. Apart from supernatural, all workings of God are supernatural, but apart from supernatural in the sense that beyond just the normal workings that God does in a day in and day out basis, that kind of supernatural intervention, I just have a hard time seeing, lines being held and ground being gained without going arm in arm as long as you can with people. And I generally think that the people that you would be arm in arm with in this scenario have a little bit more goodwill.
That's true.
When the discussion is, when that front is taken, than where we're currently at.
Yeah.
And so even if it's just getting back to we vehemently and adamantly disagree, and we have passionate discussion and debates, and maybe we even fight over it, we can go out that night and to a bar, have a beer together, eat a meal together, invite each other in each other's homes still, and then come back the next day. So I think there's a little bit of a distinguishing factor there, just on that side of things, to where you can have legitimate civil disagreements and still be close companions and friends along the way.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think Dave Rubin stopped being an atheist by going on tour with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
Which is,
in a once atheist, I don't know if Jordan would still consider himself an atheist.
He has said he believes in God.
But a once atheist and still not a Christian, as Doug Wilson recently said, kingdom adjacent or kingdom near. He's near the kingdom, but not there yet. But yes, because I think what you're saying is because of the people that were drawn to Peterson,
right?
Were generally more Christian, or at least Christian based. I hate the term like religious, but kind of religious based. That exposed to Dave Rubin.
But also that Dave Rubin and the disaffected liberals, I think is how he says it, are the ones who are more willing to discuss and approach things in good faith, like you said. So
yeah.
Okay.
All right. Let's round this off on the discussion of why we were talking, and I wanted to get into why we put so much pressure on pastors.
When you say we, you mean you and me specifically.
You and I,
with this
you
podcast.
And me specifically. Yes. Why we put so much pressure on pastors to be the ones leading this charge that we're trying to leading this rebuild movement. Now, like, we want to have the discussions on it, but ultimately we often come down heavy on pastoral leadership, on evangelical leadership. And I want to drill down on that, because I think we had a decent discussion before we recorded this as to why we go there, and maybe some of the reasons, not some of the reasons, some of the ways we can kind of shift away from that.
Yeah, it's certainly true. And here's kind of my chain of thinking of this. Okay. So let's imagine a time in America's history where the prevailing moral sentiment was largely influenced by biblical principles, to the degree that an issue like abortion would have been inconceivable. In fact, Bradley, I don't know if I told you this, but you can go all the way back to the Didache, which was like pretty much the first recorded Christian catechism in history. We're talking like maybe before 100 AD. And in that catechism, that explanation, it's not really a catechism, it's not a question and answer, but it's basically a simple explanation of what the Christian faith expects Christians to do and how to behave. In that thing from the first century, it says specifically that Christians are not allowed to abort or end the lives of babies in order to end a pregnancy of a mother. It's that old in the Christian faith. And we can imagine a time in American life where people were well informed enough about the Bible that the idea of what we're doing with abortion now would have been absolutely horrifying. Right? You could say that about a lot of the issues, transgender stuff, homosexuality, all of that would be absolutely horrifying. At some point along the way, some sort of breakdown happened where people stopped having a biblical worldview, a biblical understanding of how to approach life. Okay, and I don't think it happened from one generation to the next. It probably happened incrementally. But at some point, that broke down. Now, what needs to happen in society, and this is kind of getting into the interview that will be coming out in a couple of weeks, so I don't want to steal all the thunder from that. But what needs to happen in society, ideally, is that there would be Christian doctors who have thought through their position as a doctor who's a Christian, right? There would be Christian politicians and statesmen who have learned and thought through what it means to use the law, the civil law, for true good as God defines it. And they would be advocating, and not just advocating, but building and informing the medical culture and the judicial system and the legal system, so that laws and practices that doctors engage in would more likely and more universally align themselves with the principles. But at some point, the doctors who went on to be doctors stopped being convinced by the biblical worldview in their Sunday school or in their high school or in their college days. And at some point, that broke down. And so our question is, it probably is unreasonable to expect that pastors know what the Bible says about law, about medicine, about the legal system, about judges, about how to pass a bill, about how to influence a society politically, all of these things. Like that is understandably a very heavy burden. The pastors should know the principles. But in the event that this has broken down, I guess our contention is who is going to turn the crank of the motor? And maybe it's just our upbringing that the Word of God is the only thing that can do that. And who delivers the Word of God to God's people? It's the pastors, right? And so, all that to say is we understand that what we're asking for is maybe more than a single individual pastor is going to be able to do, become an expert in all of these things. And yet, who's going to turn the crank, right? Who is going to inform? Who's going to build a passion in the next generation of doctors and lawyers and politicians to be biblical in all of their thinking? That has to be pastors, right? That has that fuel and that culture and that sense where it's my obligation and my duty and my privilege as a doctor, a Christian doctor, to not just think through the medical journals, but the theological implications of what I'm doing. So pastors, I guess what we're saying is pastors need to turn the cranks, and parents with their children need to turn the cranks. As they're instructing their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, we need to be turning that crank of what does it mean. I'll say one other thing, and I know you want to jump in here, but just today, Abigail, my daughter, has listened to some of our podcasts. She came to me just today, and she said, "Dad, I'm so amazed that these people that you talk to have actually thought through how the Bible affects each of their things, and they're all doing a different thing. And yet this person has thought about how the Bible affects planting crops, and this person has thought about how the Bible affects literature." And my daughter was just so impressed. And I said to her, Abigail, it was a beautiful teaching moment. I said, Abigail, God expects us as individuals to take the gifts and jobs and abilities that we have and think through how we use these in a way that honors the Lord. And I said, you will have to do that someday with whatever gifts or responsibilities or job you have as well. And it kind of settled down on her in a really a way that she understood. And I was very thankful for that moment.
Oh, that's really good. Oh man, so many places to go with this. Yes, pastors need to turn the crank. They need to be the jumpstart. They need to be the spark. Not that long ago, back to the Romantic poets, they prided themselves on, as poets, as writers of words on a page, on knowing all the things that there were to know. They knew all of the mathematics, all of the science that was to know. And that was actually not just an arrogance. That was a realistic, like, no, I have a pretty good comprehension on all that there is to know. That broke down, not necessarily in a negative way, with the huge influx of knowledge, the university systems, the access to knowledge, the access to education, and then now in the current age, the internet for the past 20 years, that has broken down. So we've broken into an expert class where we all focus on our own individual fields and say, I trust you to be an expert on that. I trust you to be an expert on that. So it did, to pastors' credit, I do think it happened semi-organically, semi-naturally, where there was just so much more information at such a high velocity of knowledge and such a high level of learning that it no longer became possible to know all the known things of the universe. We've simply unlocked too much of what God has graciously provided us to unlock in the universe, and that's a positive thing that we have continued to explore. The good things God has built into the known world. But what that has done is that has made us, to a degree, lazy in the pursuit of, I'm going to borrow from the King's Hall again. Again, we had Eric Kahn on not too long ago. range, to the pursuit of range. Just because we can't know all there is to know does not mean we should not endeavor to know as much as we can know. And I think that's where we've fallen on the pastoral level, on the intellectual level, where everyone's a quote unquote expert in their field. We have simply neglected to take the knowledge of others and apply it to what we know, and pursue what they have for our own sake of pursuit, instead of just taking them at face value, or face their word. So that's one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about there. But now we're at where we're at. So yes, pastors, we put the brunt of the load on pastors because, like you aptly said, pastors are the deliverers of God's word, and change only happens through the transforming power of the Spirit in people's lives. So pastors need to understand that, and need to encourage, like you were saying with your daughter, people to pursue the pursuits that they are good at for the purposes of the kingdom, and then defer to those people for knowledge and wisdom and understanding in different areas. But they at bare minimum need to just let people pursue the pursuits they need to do. Now, I would go one step further to say pastors should be strongly advocating for and encouraging people to pursue politics, to literally being a politician. It sounds awful to be a politician, but someone has got to do it, and God has gifted Christians to do it. And we take those gifted Christians and we push them away from politics because it's messy and it's ugly, into a more noble pursuit. Whether we label it as that or not, we push gifted people in politics away from politics because we feel like it's a more spiritual or a safer alternative. But so I would say pastors need to acknowledge and identify leaders that can take the slings and arrows and can lead with authority. And once that happens, then I think we can start to get to where the burden is off of the pastors and onto the Christian politicians to go, pastors, you handle the church, we'll handle the civic realm, and we'll work in a symbiotic relationship. But until that happens, it's got to be on pastors to give the guidance, the encouragement, and at bare minimum, remove the guardrails to let people pursue the areas that God has gifted them in, instead of just trying to funnel them into education, healthcare, and pastoral ministries, which is largely what I see in my particular area. Now, that is the brunt of the workforce in Spokane is those three fields. Well, those two specifically, education and healthcare. But that's just kind of where we channel people. These are good pursuits that you can make a living on. Go do those things.
And yet, one of our great heroes of the faith is William Wilberforce. But someone was telling me just this week that Jonathan Edwards had an incredible, his children did incredible things. Several of them were state politicians and doctors, and his children really had a large influence in the society around them because they were Christian politicians, Christian doctors, things like that. And so I think you're right, Bradley. And the only thing that I would add is that even in the best situation where we have Christian politicians and Christian statesmen who are thinking things through, pastors are still responsible for giving Christians a moral vision, a cohesive moral vision of the world, where the politician and the doctor and the teacher can all kind of know where they fit.
Yep. And it can't, I'm sorry, it can't just defer to, that's a tough question and we don't have clear biblical insight, so maybe let's punt on the matter.
Mm.
It can't defer to that. There is so much precedence and so much history and so much that I think God has given us. I mean, God clearly states in Romans, the chapter that people love, Romans 13, about submitting to the authorities. He clearly states that there is a civil leadership, and that God has ordained people in those positions to be in power, and to obey their edicts is righteous, as long as their edicts are good and pure and righteous. So he clearly ordains this, but so we get into these matters that are difficult, and pastors just kind of punt on the issue because they go, "Oh, I don't." It's difficult for me to pinpoint that specific issue. So yes, the pastors need to be continuing to give that spiritual counsel, but that counsel has to be beyond just the "I don't have a good answer for you, so let's leave it there." Like I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say here, but it's got to be more that it has to be better thought out than where we're at now. And we'll get into that again.
Yep.
We've mentioned it several times, but we're going to get into that in the episode with Stephen Wolf that will come out here in the next little while.
Yep.
And then to your second point, or to your point about children, Steve Dace was just making this point, if not today, yesterday, about the fact that we know Benjamin Franklin and we know Thomas Jefferson, but we know nothing about. I mean, we know they had killed kids, but we know nothing about their kids. We don't value their children in the arc of the American history. And I think Steve was saying this to a detriment of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were great people, but what legacy did they actually leave beyond what they accomplished in the country? Like, we don't know, we don't talk about their kids. And as Christians, we should strive for our kids. Now, it's hard. I mean, like, Michael Jordan's kids are never going to be Michael Jordan in the NBA. So it is hard to follow in the footsteps of legends. But the Bible speaks to our kids being arrows in our quiver in Psalms. We should be training our kids to be equally as potent, equally as engaged, and if not more, as we are, weapons that can be used by God to win the hearts and minds of men.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I want to add to that is this idea that, I guess it's a question, and here, borrowing from King's Hall podcast again, the idea of what's the culture at a local church, right? Are churches promoting a culture where people are encouraged to not explore, I don't want to say that word, to really analyze biblically and pursue a biblical practice of their abilities and careers? And it's valuable for someone to go out and build houses. It's valuable for someone to go out and fix cars. It's valuable for someone to go be a college professor. But is the culture of the church one that says, I care that you have right theology, but I also care that you have right applied theology in your field? And this is something I don't do well. Like, I'm trying to work it into our family a little bit more and more as we go. But how do we as families, how do we as churches, how do pastors build a sense where people want to know, and they don't want just the pastor to tell them. They want to investigate. They want to think. They want to go to the Word and then come with questions. How much more helpful would it be to a pastor if you've helped build a culture where this is going on, and instead of someone just coming up to you with a random curiosity, hey, what do you think about cryptocurrency? How much more helpful would it be if there's a young man in your church who is interested in investing, and you said, go get it, and then when he comes to you as a pastor for advice, it's not just a general, what do you think about cryptocurrency in 30 seconds or less, but he's thought through like 4 or 5 or 6 specific issues, and he's brought a couple Bible verses or biblical principles, and he's like, this is what I see, and these are the specific questions I have. I'm just having a hard time connecting the dots. Like, that would be such an easier conversation for he doesn't have to be an expert in cryptocurrency then. He just has to have the discernment to connect biblical principles with the life of that young man. Like, we want to grow these cultures in our churches and in our society, and let's do it.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And you know, you and I, we want practical steps for people listening, watching to do. So while we do put a lot of the kind of kindling of the fire on the feet of pastors, we can, as members of society, members of churches, heads of households, as being husbands and fathers, we can do that work ourselves.
Yes.
And again, not to overemphasize the point here, but in doing things like what we're doing, just having the discussions, pursuing the topics and the degrees, we can make headway into stirring the culture around us. We can be, regardless of what pastors do, the pursuits that we pursue and the things we talk about and the ways we engage in our family, in our schools, in our societies, can make very small incremental wins to shifting the way people think, to shifting the way things people engage with. So a lot of it is going to be in the hands of pastors, but pastors can also use the love and the support and the encouragement and the challenging to say, let's be more, let's do more. We can do more, and pastors can't do it alone.
Yeah.
Pastors cannot do it alone. So the more members they have in their church that they see in this pursuit, the more ambitious they can feel like they can get, the more involved they think they can dig into the matter, because there's very little more frustrating than a pastoral pursuit. Now, I can't speak from a pastoral perspective, but seeing this growing up with a pastor, a father as a pastor, and a missionary, there's very little more frustrating than a pursuit that has no interest behind it, and just trying to. It's so much more rewarding when you see a need and a heart for people, and then tapping into that rather than trying to create and generate that. Yeah. So all I'm saying is we can basically present ourselves to our pastors and our leadership and say, these are things we want to pursue, help us pursue them. Yeah. And that'll be a step in the right direction for everyone involved.
Yeah. So I guess really what we said pastors need to spark and turn the crank, but really members of churches take some responsibility. Read a book about, dare I say it, read a book about something other than how to improve your marriage. Go find a resource on how to excel in your business as a Christian, or whatever it is. Walk your kids through, what it means to be a good classmate, because eventually they'll be someone's coworker. Explore as a family, pick a topic. Guys, what do you think it means to be a good owner of a pet? Right? What would the Bible say about that? Right? Build this into your family practice so that your children just become accustomed to thinking, yeah, I'll bet the Bible does have something to say about that. And then when you find it, put some practical steps of obedience in place, right? Like maybe it's something as simple as, we need to think through what kind of dog we have. And you do some research and you realize, oh, we have a dog that's very active, but we have a small yard. Okay, our obedience to caring for this God as stewards of the earth is, we need to commit to walking him 3 times a day instead of 1 time a day because our yard is small, right? And that's a real tangible thing that your kids would see as like a practical outflow of being a faithful steward of the earth and the resources that God gives you. I mean, let's really embrace this idea. And how this all relates back to abortion, that question is that will spur a generation of people who are used to thinking about what the Bible says about all areas of life, so that we're not having to have the arguments, at least in the church, about is abortion really that big of a deal? I mean, Bradley, you mentioned before we started talking that the church, the younger generation of Christians, have really moved on from this abortion thing. It's not, they really don't think it's that big of a deal. It's not something they're interested in fighting as much as previous generations. That partly tells me in this area, even, we're not, as Christian parents, passing on a biblical perspective on that issue.
Yeah, because we hang on to it like it's a souvenir of the past, and not a living embodiment of the present. It's not just some old baseball card that we're nostalgia for. It's God's living and active word. And I think for far too long, we've let things be treated like it is something important of the past, but it's not important in the past. It's important in the past, in the present, in the future. God's word and his standards will always be important, and we should always fight for them because of what they are eternally, regardless of time and place.
Yeah, good. Well, to me, that sounds like a good place to wrap things up. Anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to say?
No, I always speak my mind. No, I think that's a fine place to leave it.
I have the power of the edit, so there might be a few pieces there that I'm editing out. No, I'm just kidding.
That's true.
I don't do that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, for those of you listening or watching, thanks so much for checking out this episode. I hope you heard what Bradley and I are saying there, a real resolve, but also a real hope, right? Like, we really can grow in how to please God and how to honor him in many different areas of our lives, and seek the Lord, and he will allow himself to be understood by us when we seek him. Obviously in heaven, I think heaven will be an eternal time of diving in and understanding more and more God's will in the universe that he has created. But even now, let us seek him with confidence. And if you have a question, God, how do I excel at this? Pray and seek and look for resources and run those by your pastor and your close friends. And let's rebuild, let's grow, let's put something back together that honors God. He's certainly worthy of that. So.
Yep. Awesome.
All right. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes. We have an interesting discussion about art and an interesting discussion about political theology coming down the pike soon. So thanks so much, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.